As I mentioned earlier, ethics is a very important part of this course. Ethics will tie together a lot of things, I think, especially if you think about getting passion from your followers, motivation. Ethics is a part in all of those topics, and leadership, effective leadership, and even some of you like servant leadership. There's an ethical principle involved here, understanding other people. Also, I want to give you a few concepts from ethics that will help you to complete the ethics assignment, which is the second post that's due this week. I will open up that post this weekend so that if you finish the first post, you can start working on that second one earlier. Okay, first, a couple of very important points about ethics. What is it? And I want to contrast ethics with morality. Ethics has two major differences with morality. First of all, ethics only deals with behavior. Morality can deal with behavior or thoughts, attitudes, and whatever. You can't have an unethical thought. You can have an unethical behavior. And some people say that you can have an unethical thought, but that only matters because it leads to a behavior. So ethics deals with behavior, morality deals with behaviors and thoughts. Second of all, ethics deals with social norms. It's what's right or wrong. And to some extent, social norms can change. They change across cultures, they change across time within a culture. Morality tends to view a more religious type perspective on what's good or bad, and there are eternal rules. The Ten Commandments are supposedly eternal. It's God's rule, God's God's law, so that's not going to change ever. So ethics, behavior, morals, behavior and thoughts. Ethics, social norms that can change, morals, eternal truths, determining good or bad. So ethics, right or wrong, morals, good or bad. Second, why care about ethics? Some interesting points here. First of all, in terms of performance, firms that are ethical don't have more profits. They don't perform as well as unethical firms. You can sort of see why unethical firms are able to have certain advantages over ethical firms, and let's elaborate that. Firms that were to control costs tend to be unethical, and Walmart has basically been described as an unethical firm for a lot of reasons. It doesn't train its workers very well. It's had struggles offering adequate health care or paying living wages. It works very hard to keep workers' salaries down and doesn't treat people right by most ethical standards versus a place like Whole Foods or Gore or the more ethical firms that I mentioned earlier in this course. Some financial services firms tend to be unethical, and some of these executives are very highly paid. Citibank. Citibank has hundreds of lawsuits against it, stemming from the mortgage crisis and stemming from foreign exchange rate manipulation. Chase did the same kinds of things, and the stream of violations from banks in general, from large financial services firms, is sort of legendary, kind of showing that the firms are unethical. Yet they're very, very powerful and very, very profitable firms. Now, ethical firms tend to be more desirable places to work, so motivation may be a benefit. And I think that the examples I used earlier in terms of W.L. Gore and Google and Whole Foods kind of show that ethical organizations that have these more considerate or more collaborative type or more inclusive type work environments, firms that are desirable places to work, tend to be that way and tend to therefore get the most out of the employees, they probably also cost a little more. So there's a there's a cost to that benefit, and what's what's the profit margin of each? It's sort of undeterminate. Now, ethical sensitivity is a personal characteristic that enables people to recognize the presence of an ethical issue. Not all managers have ethical sensitivity. Some of them will just go ahead and do something if that's what was done in the past, or for some other reason, without thinking about the ethical principles that. Okay, there are some concepts here, but I'm just going to sort of like describe ethical behavior in firms to get a feeling for the kinds of issues that are at stake. Unethical behavior in firms can take thousands of different forms, but let's look at a few classes. Fraud, of course. Harassment. Sexual harassment is a big topic, but harassment in terms of in many different types of toxic personalities that harass, bully others. Some of it is legally actionable, some of it is not. Discrimination in many forms, child labor, unsafe conditions, conflict of interest. If you have managers making decisions where they have a personal interest at stake, is unethical. Unfair treatment. A recent topic, of course, is green. A lot of companies are considered ethical these days because they treat the environment very well. The oil companies, of course, are a big case in point. Now, unethical behavior of firms often takes something I call the compliance model of ethics. What the compliance model says is that our firm is ethical because we are not caught breaking any laws. Okay, got that? So firms will consider themselves ethical because their operations are legal. They use the legal definitions to determine what is ethical. Now, of course, I've worked in some of these firms. Unfortunately, my past is a little bit checkered. What happens is managers will tend to commit fraud, have unsafe conditions, as long as there's plausible deniability or as long as it can't be proven by a lawyer. That's often the case. In reality, managers actually know that what they're doing is illegal or certainly unethical, but they don't mind because it's profitable and they get their bonus and everyone else is doing it, and it helps the profit of the company. Now, the compliance model tends to have ethics in the organization ruled by lawyers. The goal is to avoid misbehavior, that is, especially misbehavior that can be proven in court. And there's an assumption of self-interest, so that people in a compliance model, the assumption is that everybody's out to maximize their personal well-being with a minimum of effort. I'm going to contrast this unethical behavior in firms and the way it tends to be justified with ethical behavior in firms. Firms that I mentioned, of course, the Whole Foods, the Gores, the Googles, and the thousands of firms that are very ethical out there, tend to have a different approach to ethics. It's not so much that the law determines what's ethical, but rather the managers of the firm determine what's ethical. Managers of a firm, like I say, ethics implies conformance with norms. Firms can set within themselves their own norms for respectful treatment of others, norms for allowing all employees to reach their potential, norms for any number of very important values that firms may have. Now, if firms do have this kind of code of conduct, if they have these kinds of high value, if they have a reward system that includes ethical behavior as a criterion for performance evaluation, it follows not the compliance model, but the integrity model, where firms will develop their own values and norms, and where ethical conduct becomes part of the culture of the firm. Contrasting with the assumption of self-interest of the compliance model, in the integrity model, there's an assumption that people are motivated by self-interest, but also by idealism, and also by relationships with peers. So that I think it's a more inclusive way to look at the motivation of people. And indeed, there are lots of people out there who are indeed motivated by idealism and relationship with peers. So there's a nice argument for the ethical behavior. So here's some examples. The unethical behavior of firms sort of explains why some firms don't get it. And the bottom one explains why some firms do. And hopefully I've given you something else to think about when looking at your own firms. I'm going to offer you 4 different ways, at least, to look at ethical decisions and how to determine, in addition to those examples of fraud, conflict of interest, unsafe conditions, and so forth, just a general theoretical approach as to how we can determine what ethics are, how we can frame an ethics decision, the ethicalness of a decision. The first principle is utilitarianism. Defined here, utilitarianism basically says a decision is ethical if the results of that decision, if the outcomes of that decision, all the outcomes to everybody in the whole world, if the sum total of the positive outcomes outweighs the sum total of the negative outcomes, so the good consequences versus the bad consequences. For example, if you fire somebody as a manager, is that ethical? Well, you could argue that firing somebody is ethical if the good that comes out of that. Now, the good could be the person that you fire is a bad role model and was not setting a bad example in any number of ways, was not performing, and by firing that person, you motivate the rest. You demonstrate that the values are better for everyone else, so you help motivation. It could also save cost. Saving costs means you keep the firm in business, you keep it profitable, and keep it in business. And all the good that comes out of a firm being in business is in terms of providing a livelihood for the workers and goods for the customers and so forth are good things. You can even look at the person fired, and maybe in the long run that person will be better off after being fired. Look at the bad parts of firing somebody. You could put survivor's guilt on the rest of the organization. You could hurt that person, the person you fire, to a great extent, and that person's family. That's a bad consequence too. So utilitarianism would basically say, let's look at all those consequences. If the good outweighs the bad, and we don't really know that because it's impossible to measure, but if we can argue that the good outweighs the bad, then we have an ethical decision. Second ethical principle, individual rights. Basically, individual rights says that everybody as a human being, we have inalienable rights. We have rights that need to be protected. If we don't protect the dignity or we don't respect the rights of any individual, then we are not being ethical. Some call this a Kantian principle. Some call it rights. There are rights theories, and that so there's a very there's a number of ideas along here. Now, let's look at an example of firing somebody. Firing somebody is perfectly ethical in the individual rights theory if, when that person was hired, they agreed to an employment contract, and most of us do. The contract says that you can be fired for cause, and cause is defined in some way. Well, once you sign that contract and you're hired, then you can be fired because you agreed when you were hired that these are the conditions of employment, and somebody made that decision that you were no longer in compliance. So firing is easier to justify as long as the conditions of employment are specified. But there are other rights that are not so easily dealt with. For example, freedom of movement. People have the right to to associate with with others. They have the right to move, to live where they want to live, and they have the rights. They have certain freedoms, and you can't restrict those under any circumstance. Maybe a nice one here. Let's see. Slavery. Slavery means that someone is forced to work, even for a salary. And slavery is unethical, not to mention illegal, in most parts of the world. Well, why can we say that most of us, if you feel trapped in your job, why is that not slavery? And the answer is all of us in the United States can quit our jobs at any time. That's not true. If you're in the military, you can't, but most of us in the private sector, we can quit our jobs at any time. It's not illegal to just not, it's okay. It's legal, it's ethical to just not show up to work. Why? Because we're not slaves. We can quit our jobs at any time. It would be nice to notify our employer, but it's not unethical to do that. So the rights theories say that as a firm, as a manager, as a leader, we can make decisions that are ethical as long as we don't violate the individual rights. Physical security is another one. We can't make anybody travel to a country where they could be in danger, or go to a part of a city where they could be in danger. Physical security is not something that you can ethically risk with your behaviors. Now, I like the individual rights theories for another reason. I mentioned early on that ethics is a function of norms in a society, so they can change. However, there are some things that are always right, or always wrong at least, in terms of ethics, so that to some extent ethics can change with norms, but to some extent ethical principles are written in stone. And I can refer to the UN Declaration of Human Rights, and there's the website right there. The United Nations Declaration of Human Rights specifies norms or behaviors that are always unethical. So there is an eternal part of, like I say, that these individual rights are pretty much a function of the fact that we're human beings worthy of dignity and respect. In addition to utilitarianism and individual rights theories, there are some justice theories. Distributive justice is linked to equity theory and motivation that I explained way back in the motivation slide. And it's the idea that people's burdens and benefits should be similar. So in other words, if somebody is paid more than somebody else in a firm, then that person who's paid more should bear more of the burden of the work of the firm. than somebody paid less. And two people who bear similar burdens within the firm in terms of responsibilities, requirements, and so forth should receive similar benefits. So distributive justice is violated in some very classic cases. If women are paid less than men, that's a distributive justice issue. For doing the same work, that's a distributive justice issue. If one division of a firm is paid more than another division of a firm, and you can't justify that on any burden argument, that we have a distributive justice issue. Contrasting with distributive justice is the idea of procedural justice. Procedural justice says that the methods for investigating, the methods for adjudicating and determining whether a practice is fair or unfair is similar for different classes of people. So, if you have an unjust claim, a claim of unfairness raised by a man in an organization, then the way to investigate that and the way to determine that should be very similar, as if a woman made the same sort of claim of unfairness. So procedural justice just describes the means by which the fairness and unfairness of decisions is determined, and it would be just if the same procedures were followed for all people, in all cases. And to end up this particular presentation on ethical principles, I'd like to give you a challenge. Consider an ethical dilemma, and in the assignment on part 2 of the discussion board, I require you to look at something that Lincoln faced. But consider any ethical dilemma, and it would be interesting for you to identify such ethical dilemmas. Please keep looking for them. So you find out that the firm you work for has a practice of deceiving its customers. For example, you could whistleblow, or you could quit, or you could change your ethical sensitivity and tolerate it. So there are a number of ways you can handle this, and you want to do neither. But what can you do? How do you cope with this? I don't have any answers for you except to say that it's a very difficult thing to do, very stressful living in an organization. If you have a conscience, if you have a strong sense of values, if you have compassion for anyone who is hurt by unethical behavior, and it's hard to tolerate that. How do you cope? It's going to shorten your life if you're like most people. I can only ask a question. I hope that at some point you quit. You could also whistleblow. You could use any influence tactic. You can go upward appeal. You can try to persuade people not to do the unethical behavior. You can get yourself promoted to a position of power and then change it. That's very difficult to do. Quitting is certainly an option. Now, suppose you have quit and you're looking for another job. How can you avoid being in a place where you'll face another ethical dilemma? And I think that as we go through our careers, we learn to avoid bad places. I want you to learn how to avoid bad places. Learn how to interview the firms and see what kind of culture it is. Gather information that you would need to look at the distributive justice, the codes of conduct, the policies and procedures of an organization, and avoid the places that you just can't tolerate. If you can avoid such dilemmas, I think your quality of life will greatly improve. Good luck with that.